The world of comedy is home to some of the largest names in the entertainment industry. Titans like Bill Burr and Dave Chappelle are dominating the internet, and younger comedians like Shane Gillis use their podcast platforms to drive traffic directly to their stand-up tours. But as popular as these titans are, there are few mainstream comedians that can be argued to have blown up primarily because of their YouTube presence, and very few have done it as well as Theo Von. Over the decade he spent on the platform, Theo has become a household name in the comedy world in a way not a lot of other comedians have been able to, becoming one of the most successful in the industry. But people are complicated. Not everyone's life is sunshine and rainbows. What we see is the massive success. What not everyone thinks about is the years of struggle that preceded it. But before I go any further, experience the joy of diverse culinary entertainment with today's sponsor, Cook Unity. Cook Unity is a chef collective that partners with culinary innovators and award winners across the US to bring you an at-home dining experience you won't find anywhere else. It's a chef-to-you delivery service that sends you fresh, never frozen meals that are easy to prepare, so you never have to miss a Turkey Tom video while slaving away in the kitchen. And you can select what you get ahead of time, so you're getting only what you want to eat. And the subscription is super flexible, and you can pause, skip weeks, or cancel at any time. No more ramen noodles and 7-Eleven pizza boys. This is the real deal. With Cook Unity, you'll feel like you're eating at a different restaurant every night. If you're vegetarian or paleo or even vegan, they have options for you as well. They really have put a lot into making sure these meals are great and that you want to eat them. They're delivered fully cooked, so all you have to do is heat them up, and through a weekly subscription, you can select from an ever-changing menu of handcrafted meals. Check out this lamb curry meatball meal with lentils made by Chef Michelle Williams in Chicago. You're gonna want to see this. So what are you waiting for? Go to cookunity.com/turkey50 to get 50% off your first order of Cook Unity meals to try them out for yourself. It's linked in the description as well. Okay, now back to the video. Theo Von, legally Theodore Capitani von Kernatowski, was born March 19th, 1980, to his then 70-year-old father, Roland Theodore Achilles von Kernatowski, and his 32-year-old mother, Gina Capitani, in Covington, Louisiana. One of the most common trends in Theo's comedy is his stories from childhood. While many of these are likely exaggerated or outright fabricated for the purpose of entertainment, if even 30% of them are real, then this dude had a pretty funny upbringing. One story he recalled is going to a friend's house and then going outside to hang out with him and one other friend. After a while, he left them behind and went back inside the friend's house. Now, the friend's father was known for having some rather negative views of gay people. Knowing this, Theo decided to pull a prank, and he told the father that his son and that one other friend looked to be touching each other strangely outside. As a result, the father bolted out of the house to see his son and to shout him down like he just game-ended his infant brother, all the while Theo watched in the background, laughing his ass off. In particular, Theo noted the father had used the phrase queerin' around. In another example, Theo remembered this one extremely kooky character, a man of very short temper who happened to have no arms. Theo explained how this armless man was one of the scariest people around, willing and eager to fight anyone who even looked at him. In particular, he was described to quite literally wrap his own neck around other people's necks to choke them out as well as shoulder punch them. As Theo would go on to explain, the armless man came from a whole family of kooky characters, including a guy who had sharpened half his teeth to be like shark teeth, and a boy who got around on wheelchair not because he was disabled, but because he'd just never been taught how to walk. To round out these examples, Theo presented what he believes to be the first real example of a so-called wigger, which is a term used to describe a white person who tries to emulate or acquire the behavior and tastes stereotypically associated with black people. Theo recalls how, when this kid showed up to school to get signed up, his speech and mannerisms were so foreign to the school workers that he was put in a special ed class with kids suffering from Down syndrome as well as otherwise disabled kids. Regardless of whether these stories are actually true, the ones we just told frankly sound partially fake, Theo's ability to sell them as such for the sake of comedy is simply on another level. However, what really helps sell it is his ability to simply word things in a way that is most amusing, which is a skill that he's been developing since he was a child when he got a rhyming book as a gift from a friend.
When I was a kid, they had a boy in our neighborhood named Mario, right? And he was, dude, he ended up dying actually. He did some pills and drove into an embankment. But when I was young, he would in his yard make me bury it. And that's how I was allowed to be friends with him.
Despite these humorous stories, it's not hard to see that Theo's childhood was not exactly easy. Their family lived in relative poverty, and with Covington already being quite an unsafe city to live in, it's no surprise that Theo often describes his childhood quite negatively. In a rather telling interview, Theo described how he was always scared as a kid. He went into detail about how dangerous their neighborhood really was, with crazed tweakers openly out on the streets. He also recalled how people would drive up to their house and throw bricks at it, yelling obscenities at them as they did so. He even recalls how he'd set up an alarm system by his door using a string with bells on it, which he hoped would wake him up if anyone anyone were to enter the room. Theo describes how, going to school, he was always one of the smaller kids, and due to how rough the neighborhood was, he realized early on that humor was his only saving grace, going as far as to say that doing comedy was the only thing that really helped him with feelings of depression. In general, Theo's upbringing tends to be one of the things he jokes about the most, and a large part of these jokes derive from having such an old father. In one of his podcasts, Theo described how his relationship with him had always been somewhat strained, and how whenever other kids would joke about his father's age, he would often end up joining it to avoid being ridiculed, which caused him to lose a lot of respect for his father. Another large part of why Theo became a comedian was actually due to his mom. In an excerpt from his podcast, he describes how he always struggled to emotionally connect with her, recalling how he couldn't remember her ever laughing, and how he ended up spending much of his time trying to make her laugh. Perhaps the most concerning tale was about him apparently being molested by his brother. In stand-up, he describes that when he was 5 years old, his then 7-year-old brother would try to get with him. He doesn't go into much detail about these specifics, opting to instead focus on how he supposedly stopped his brother from doing it by using jingle bells as so-called alarm gates. It's practically impossible to tell if there's any real validity to this story, and he was very clearly playing the whole thing up for laughs. It's definitely a comment to be wary of, but unless this is ever discussed in more detail, it's better to just assume it was all a big joke. Whatever other stories he may have to say about his life, one thing is clear. He did not have an easy childhood, and it didn't transition into an easy adolescence. When he was just 14 years old, his older brother left to live with his grandparents. Theo's parents were divorced at that point, and his mother was not really capable of taking care of him anymore, and at her behest, Theo ended up seeking emancipation. At just 14 years of age, he became an emancipated minor. Only 2 years later, in 1996, his father would die at the age of 86 after a long fight with cancer. As for Theo, he would finish high school in 1998, at which point he began shopping for colleges. He ended up transferring multiple times, eventually going to Louisiana State University, where he studied philosophy. While he never actually completed his philosophy degree, his stay at university would go on to be a defining moment of his later career.
I mean, I had no plans of going to comedy or being a comedian. I didn't have any. I was just walking across campus at college, and I was just like really, really depressed, and they had like auditions, and then they called me one day and they asked me to go on this trip, you know? And I was like, oh, this is going to be really, really interesting.
According to Theo, while he went to Arizona State University in 1998, there was an ongoing recruitment for the show Road Rules. He decided to apply, but he didn't end up getting the part. Then, a year later, when he went to LSU, the same recruitment office opened up, and he applied again. This time, he managed to land the role. Road Rules was a reality TV show that ran from 1995 to around 2007, netting a tidy 14-season run. The concept was quite simple. 6 strangers between the ages of 18 to 24 would be stripped of their possessions and forced to live in an RV, traveling from location to location to accomplish certain tasks in order to win a prize. Each season, the tasks and the prizes would be a bit different, but they all allowed roughly the same formula. In 1999, Theo had been recruited as a contestant for the 9th season of the show. Among all the other contestants, who were by and large just normal people, Theo ended up standing out quite a bit, both due to the fact that he had a unique story to share with people and due to his unapologetic attempts at comedy, many of which went right over the other contestants' heads.
Yeah, I got this dream that I got here, and everyone else was Japanese. I didn't speak a word of English.
Japanese?
I can't deal with Asian people that much, I don't think.
Oh my!
Well, I've just had trouble dealing with them.
Theo. He's 19, he's young. He probably hasn't been around a lot of people of color.
Theo quickly ended up becoming a fan favorite, and although he didn't actually win the overall contest, the boost in popularity he had gotten from his appearance became the catalyst for all his later success in the entertainment industry. For the next couple years, Theo became a bit of a household name on MTV, as he played the role of contestant in a number of their reality TV shows between 2000 and 2006. He made an appearance in 3 seasons of the Road Rules spin-off show called The Challenge, including Battle of the Seasons, The Gauntlet, Battle of the Sexes 2, and Fresh Meat. He ended up winning in 2 of those seasons and placed well in the rest, once again becoming a fan favorite along the way. Fundamentally though, whether he won or lost was mostly irrelevant. At the end of the day, what really mattered was the continuous boost in popularity. However, this reality TV show streak was not an entirely positive experience. In 2006, Theo moved to Los Angeles in order to jumpstart his career as a comedian. However, he struggled to catch the interest of agents, who had mostly typecast him as a reality TV show regular with little real talent beyond that. That said, he knocked on enough doors to find success. In the same year, he managed to get his first proper stand-up gig in the NBC show Last Comic Standing, which was a competitive TV show for stand-ups. Theo himself did not technically participate in the mainline elimination phases of the show, as he was instead part of a first-time special extension to the competition called Last Comic Downloaded. In it, 5 comedians would submit tapes of their stand-up routines in an attempt to win over viewers, who would then vote on 2 of the best candidates by downloading their stand-up routines. The 2 selected candidates would then get the opportunity to perform live. In the end, Theo managed to get through the eliminations, which allowed him to perform.
Got a pretty crazy life, man. My father was 70 years old when I was born. 70. Gets better. My mother was 32. Shortly after I was born, my dad had one of his strokes, so we were both learning to walk at the same time, and we would play games like catch or don't.
Needless to say, his routine was very popular with viewers. More so, it demonstrated some of the comedic qualities which he would come to rely on throughout his career going forward, making light of his upbringing and relying on his keen ability to share some utterly absurd anecdotes. And thankfully, Theo actually won. Just 2 years later, he would perform his comedy act in Live at Gotham. More importantly, though, he was featured as a contestant in another stand-up competition show called Reality Bites Back, a short-lived reality TV show aired on Comedy Central, whose main aim was to spoof other competitive reality TV shows of this sort. The show started with 10 competitors who would participate in various spoof challenges. Every week, one contestant would be eliminated until there was only one left. The actual point of the show was for the contestants to compete over who could make the audience laugh the most, and they, along with the host, were the ones who would ultimately pick the winner. Utilizing his comedic chops, Theo cruised his way all the way to the last episode without much struggle, where he claimed victory, beating Amy Schumer as runner-up. Now, I don't know why or how Amy Schumer managed to get runner-up, so just don't question it. At this point, the name Theo Von held some weight within the world of comedy, and shortly after winning the Reality Bites Back competition, he went on a stand-up tour across the US. In January 2010, Theo registered a website domain simply called cranktext.com. The website was created entirely to facilitate a new hobby of his, which he called crank texting. Put simply, crank texting is messaging completely random numbers and either pretending you know them or simply being a bit of a nuisance to them for comedic effect.
About 6 months ago, I get a random text message on my phone from a phone number that I don't know. It says, "Hey, it's Wanda." Now, obviously, she has the wrong number, okay? But also, she has the wrong in person because I have tons of free time. And for 6 months, she and I have been texting. She thinks I'm her cousin, and I actually have a godnephew now named Damari, who's going to be 2 years old in May. But anyway, I'm like, this is so much fun just texting random people that I'm just going to text every number in the world because I have unlimited text and I have total free time. And then I take the best ones and put them on a website. It's called Crank Text. So if you get a chance, check it out.
As many of his comedic hijinks, this ended up becoming yet another success for Theo, and the website quickly grew in popularity, later being sold to College Humor, although it's not clear how much revenue this netted him. Today, podcasts are one of the most popular entertainment mediums, bringing in hundreds of millions of listeners every month. I'd actually argue at this point there's probably too many podcasts. This was hardly the case in 2011, when podcasts were just in their infancy, and many people didn't see a point in listening to two people blabbering about some substanceless drivel online. They only wanted to hear that on the radio. Enter the Comedy Sideshow. Originally uploaded to the Sideshow Network website, the show was a part of a large repertoire of video podcast series run by different people, with the Comedy Sideshow being just one among them. The premise is simple. Theo would invite celebrities from the comedy world for a podcast-style interview, which he would mainly use as a vehicle for jokes, be it at the expense of the interviewee or simply giving some of his famous stories.
I actually grew up, we had a cousin named Gary who was blind. One year we hit him with a bunch of, we heated up a bunch of fence boards in the fire and hit him with them. So... Oh, and then also one year we told him there were dragons outside.
The show actually got a decent listenership on iTunes, supposedly being in the top 10 most downloaded podcasts regularly at one point. In the end, though, it didn't last very long, and the 23rd episode became the last one to ever be released. Following the Comedy Sideshow, Theo took his time before jumping back in. But in 2012, he got a lucky break when he became a host for Primetime in No Time, a show by Yahoo, as in like the search engine, that was supposed to give a comedic retelling of the most buzzed moments in television from the day prior. For Theo, this was mostly a vehicle to push his comedy to even more people. The show did have a sizable audience, getting an average of 6.7 million viewers a month, which gave him a rather sizable platform to gain further popularity from. The same year, he would guest on the 7th episode of The Half Hour, yet another stand-up comedy show, where among other things, he advertised his crank texting website. As usual, his appearance was quite a success, becoming one of the most viewed episodes of the first season. A year later, in 2013, Theo landed yet another hosting job, which he would do alongside the Primetime in No Time show called Deal With It. It was ostensibly a prank show, wherein Theo, with the help of a guest, would dare a random contestant to pull pranks in public. It ended up being renewed for another 2 seasons until it was canceled in late 2014. With his tenure at Primetime in No Time and Deal With It ending the same year, Theo found himself with a lot of time on his hands. Apparently, so did a lot of other people, as this is when the podcasting medium really started to take off, with shows like the Joe Rogan Experience starting to hit their stride. Sometime in 2015, Theo, with the help of filmmaker Matthew Weiss, started a podcast called Allegedly. The basic premise behind the show was that Theo and Matthew would try to one-up each other with crazy stories from the world of entertainment, which which could be true or could be completely fictional. This attempt ended up being a fair bit more successful than the last one, running for 123 episodes before it was finally canceled, with the final installment being uploaded around 2018. But in the midst of the show, it seems Theo came to realize that much of its popularity came from him specifically. He had a keen ability to captivate viewers all by himself without necessarily needing a foil to bounce off of. He already had a YouTube channel all the way back in 2006, following his success in Last Comic Standing. He had mostly used it to repost clips of his stand-ups as well as his appearances on TV, getting only a couple of views for his trouble. But in 2016, he released a video simply titled This Past Weekend.
Okay, this is on now. Yeah, this past weekend, I was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I flew back this morning to Los Angeles. Chattanooga was a surprising place, man. I thought I'd pass.
As you can see, it was incredibly simple in terms of production, with really nothing in terms of visuals and only Theo's words to captivate the viewers. It was almost more of a spoken blog. Based on the first impression, this really doesn't seem like much. The episode has less than 10,000 views on the original upload. However, this video, and later a series of videos, and the basic concept behind them would become the blueprint for something much greater. Later in 2016, Theo caught a lucky break, starring in a Netflix comedy special simply titled No Offense. This hour-long stand-up comedy routine was pretty much exactly what you'd expect. And while his core audience did seem to enjoy it, going by comments on YouTube clips of the special, it actually was reviewed quite poorly on sites such as IMDb. If you read some of the more helpful reviews, they tend to focus on the fact that the special just didn't really feel like Theo, and it didn't play to his strengths as a comedian, with too much focus on offensive comedy and not enough space for his natural storytelling ability to shine through. But despite the somewhat poor reception on review sites, he didn't let it stop his role. Later that year, Theo revisited This Past Weekend as a concept and decided to really start taking it seriously by turning it into a podcast, whose first episode came out on the 19th of December. At this point, it was still incredibly low production, and the views were nothing to write home about. But for what it was a stable foundation for iterating upon, and even if the views were not spectacular at the outset, the viewership across the following episodes was relatively stable, reliably getting in excess of 10,000 views. Though middling in comparison to the success he would later find, he didn't stop pursuing the podcast, reliably releasing at least one episode a week well into 2017, in between continuing to pursue his stand-up comedy career. But again, he hadn't really hit his stride yet, and he was relatively unknown online. That would all change on February 28th, 2017, when Theo made an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience number 925. As ever, he would end up charming Joe and his audience with his comedic wit. While the immediate impact on Theo's channel was not massive, it was still visible. The previous This Past Weekend episode, released prior to the JRE podcast, had come out on the previous day, getting around 16,000 views, and the one uploaded just a week later got double the views, and this trend would continue from then on, with every succeeding podcast getting at least 20,000. However, while the long-term impact was not immediately evident, this one appearance would go on to cause a ripple that continued to echo for the next several years, as Theo's YouTube viewership continued to grow steadily. What helped garner more viewers was also the re-upload of the most popular clips from the podcast, which often gained multiple times the hits of the original, and were casually sent around from person to person, with the recipients often wanting to know more about this funny guy with a southern drawl. Besides podcasting, Theo would continue doing stand-up, uploading the best clips to his YouTube channel, some of which began to gather hundreds of thousands of views. In fact, some of his more contemporary stand-ups actually got millions of views, even further boosting his popularity. Theo would make 2 more appearances on the podcast in 2018, including episodes 1118 and 1141, and both of them only brought more attention to his channel. Soon enough, by the tail end of 2018, he was getting almost 100,000 views per podcast episode, with some breakout ones even reaching upwards of 500,000 views.
You had the thing with the Logan Paul thing that happened, right? Did you know that was going to go as crazy as it did?
No, I didn't think he'd respond. As soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, I got the best thing to say.
Yeah.
And I posted it. I went to bed.
Yeah.
And I woke up and it was like I was on The Tonight Show in 1985.
Wow.
It was like people were like, hey, man, what's up? Got your back. Logan Paul. And I was walking down the street. And I was like, Jesus Christ.
Allow me to introduce you to my friend, Brendan Schaub. If you know anything about him, you know he's not exactly the most beloved comedian on YouTube. Brendan got a start as a UFC fighter, fighting in the ring from the tail end of 2009 to around 2014 in the heavyweight division. He had a somewhat middling record of 10 wins and 5 losses, and most people would tell you he was an average fighter at best. While Brendan had tried his hand at a lot of different things besides the UFC, including acting and a gig as a fight analyst, what really matters today is his stand-up comedy and podcast career. Brendan began his first podcast all the way back in 2013 with Brian Callen, called The Fighter and the Kid. In short, Brendan and Brian rambled on about various topics, with a slight preference for news from the world of professional fighting. But really, that's taken a backseat to pop culture, celebrity drama, and personal stories from the road. Following his retirement from UFC, Brendan took a shot at being a stand-up comedian, touring the country with Brian until about 2016, at which point he went solo. It's hard to argue Brendan was a breakout success. While The Fighter and the Kid podcast did well for what it was, his other comedy ventures were not nearly as successful. Most of his real success had come from working for Fox Sports, sports as a fight sports commentator. That was until 2018. In December, Theo Von and Brendan Schaub teamed up to create a new podcast. They called it The King and the Sting. It was a slight departure from Brendan's other show, but was more or less right in line with Theo's style of content as far as comedy podcasts went. With Theo's track record, it should be no surprise that the show was a success. In fact, the pilot episode was such a success for Theo that it ended up getting over 400,000 views in his lifetime. The show was loved by viewers, who universally complimented the magnetic chemistry between Theo and Brendan. But of course, much of the podcast's success can be credited to Theo himself, who is undoubtedly the star of the show. Perhaps even more than his Joe Rogan appearances, King and the Sting is what truly propelled Theo into stardom. While the podcast regularly got hundreds of thousands of views per episode during the 4 years Theo was on, his own channel, and especially his own podcast, soared in popularity, going from getting less than 100K per episode to upwards of 300K views per upload within just a couple of years. For a long time, this success went pretty much uninterrupted, with many of Brendan's friends making appearances on the show, including Eric Griffith and Chris D'Elia. Theo also continued to make appearances on JRE throughout his tenure on The King and the Sting, becoming a regular. While both Theo and Brendan found success largely due to this podcast, that's not to say they didn't meet trouble along the way. Or perhaps more accurately, it doesn't mean Brendan didn't meet trouble along the way. Pretty much all throughout Brendan and Theo's tenure at The King and the Sting, Brendan constantly attracted drama. People online criticized him a lot for his conduct, his generally poor performance as a comedian, and many other things. This culminated in multiple videos being made about him, of which perhaps the most popular was the one by Ghost Gum, but the first video that really started this massive wave of dissent was by Beige Frequency. By the time Ghost Gum came along, everything was at a boiling point, and when he uploaded his video on the 30th of June 2022, it went in depth about pretty much all of his controversies, discussing everything from his failed football career, his unimpressive MMA career, him mooching off of far more popular personalities to garner clout, his two horrendous comedy specials, as well as various accusations, including copyright striking YouTubers who criticized him, and even threatening to sue the cast of Trash Tuesday for sharing a story about someone, who later turned out to be Brendan, allegedly soliciting one of the cast for sex, despite the fact that he's married with kids. The video was a massive success, netting Ghost Gum over 3 million views. While not the only one, Ghost Gum's was the culmination of collective hatred towards Brendan, finally reaching a boiling point and popping. It's at this point in the history of the podcast we may notice that Theo slowly stopped appearing in all of the episodes of The King and the Sting, and there were a few episodes that came out even before that video where Theo just wasn't there prior to him leaving the show entirely. They largely had lower views than the ones he was in, with his episodes just performing way better. Now, while we do have most of the puzzle pieces laid out, there's still one more left on board, so let's quickly talk about Chris D'Elia. He was one of a number of Brendan's comedian friends who, among other things, made a number of appearances on the King and the Sting podcast. In fact, as years wore on, he would sometimes sit in the host chair with Brendan instead of Theo, even at a time when Theo was supposed to be there. In mid-2020, Chris D'Elia was involved in a scandal, which started with a Twitter user at GirlPowerTBH making a series of tweets following the revelation that Chris D'Elia would be cast in a Netflix show called You. She alleged that when she was a minor, she had been groomed by Chris D'Elia, who would have been in his 30s at the time. She provided some screenshots of their supposed conversations as proof of the fact. What followed was a large public outcry against Chris, with multiple girls coming out to accuse him, with some of them providing even more supposed text conversations with him as proof of the fact that this had happened. On the 29th of September 2020, Theo released another episode of This Past Weekend, in which he addressed the accusations made against Chris D'Elia. In it, he doesn't really give much of an opinion, speaking frankly that he doesn't really know what to make of the situation, and that he's not dismissing the possibility that articles being written about Chris at the time were mostly hit pieces, but also being open to the information being real.
Do I believe that the articles that people have written, like a lot of it seems like hit pieces to me, but also I don't know everything about it. You know, I don't know what a lot of his behaviors were. Like, really know.
In the end, though, he stays very neutral, which I think is good. Strangely, soon after the allegations first hit the mainstream in June of 2020, a short video came out arguing Theo had exposed Chris even before the drama had started, including a short clip from This Past Weekend in which he makes a joke about Chris.
Rob Chris. You know, you go see him, pretend you're a fan, go, oh, dude, I love your stand-up.
Yeah.
Psych. Gun out.
Oh, I'm gonna dress up like
up.
a 17-year-old girl, dude, go into his place, him, and then steal a bunch of...
Wait, he doesn't underage girls, though.
No, dude, no.
Chris is so far from being a pedophile. Everyone should know this on the internet, by the way. He won't someone under 60.
Yeah.
No chance.
No.
I've never seen Chris hanging out with a woman under 60 in my entire life.
Many viewers speculate that this was Theo making a joke that only other comedians who knew Chris would get, as only other people behind the scenes could have known about these rumors before they turned into public allegations. But definitively, all you can say is that Theo made a joke, and he jokes about everyone. It's very possible he just happened to hit the nail on the head. As time went on, Theo started to appear less and less on The King and the Sting, which revealed that the podcast just wasn't as successful without him. On the 9th of September 2022, King and the Sting released an episode in which Theo officially announced he was to depart from it altogether. While he didn't give much of a reason for why he was leaving, the implication given by him and Brendan was that he had some personal problems he needed to deal with. At the end of the day, there are assumptions we can make about why he may have left, and you don't need to look much further than his channel analytics. Shortly after leaving The King and the Sting, Theo refocused fully on his own stuff, as well as making many different podcast appearances, including even more guest spots on Rogan. This led to an explosion in popularity, wherein his monthly views and subscribers basically tripled in the immediate aftermath. While we can probably credit a good deal of this new traffic to his departure from King and the Sting, we have to be aware of one thing that was happening around this time, which most likely had an even more pronounced effect on his channel: TikTok and other short-form content. Around this time, re-uploads of his clips began to explode on TikTok, with his own TikTok account getting up to tens of millions of views on each clip, and various unaffiliated repost accounts getting hundreds of thousands to millions to even tens of millions in their own right. All of this new attention resulted in traffic being funneled into his channel, which truly caused his content to skyrocket. Notably though, as he grew in popularity, he seemed to distance himself from the old crew of The King and the Sting, which was now renamed to The Golden Hour. This is despite the fact that in his goodbye message to The King and the Sting crowd, he said he would occasionally visit, which didn't really happen. It's hard to see this as anything but a calculated move at this point, given that Theo's own podcast was getting dramatically more viewership than The Golden Hour, while the latter continues to slip. In fact, there are a lot more reasons to believe that Theo had severed connections with the old crew. In the Joe Rogan Experience 1994, Theo makes a passing comment about a 35-year-old comedian dating a 17-year-old.
If you just graduated and you're 18 and your girlfriend is 17, that's completely normal. Yeah. But if you're 19 and she's 17, people start to look a little sideways. That extra 12 months makes a big difference.
Yeah, and if you are 35 and she's 17, you can't be a comedian anymore. I'll tell you that.
Are you sure?
I don't know. I don't know. Who knows? I mean, who knows, bro?
Who knows?
I don't know.
This seems to harken back to the allegations against Chris D'Elia. Even more substantial evidence of Theo distancing himself from The King and the Sting comes when he's on another podcast with Kyle from Nelk. The host asks him where he got the name Rat King, and Theo was very non-specific about it, completely avoiding the fact that it was actually Brendan Schaub who gave him the name in the first place.
What's up with the Rat King?
Oh, the name?
Yeah.
Yeah, some people just called me the Rat King a long time ago. I think it just stuck, you know?
How do you get that nickname?
They had a character that was on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
For context, the name Rat King, which has since become a key part of Theo's entire marketing persona, had actually been conceived of during his guest appearance on the Fighter and the Kid podcast with Brendan Schaub.
You look like you hang out with rats. I look like... Bro, you look like the Rat King.
Given all of this, Theo distancing himself from all things to do with Brendan definitely appears to be a calculated move, and since we've already discussed the sheer magnitude of controversies he and his friends were involved in, this should hardly be a surprise. Some would blame Theo for this and say he's switching up on his friends for the promise of more success, but really, when your friends are Chris D'Elia and Brendan Schaub, wouldn't you want a change of scenery too? So far, the way I've portrayed Theo's life may seem quite positive, all things considered. Other than a very rocky childhood, it's mostly a story of a man working very hard to achieve his dream of being a comedian and eventually achieving it. But things are never that simple, and the truth is, Theo himself has had a lot of demons to contend with in his adulthood. Theo became a coke addict relatively early in his life, describing his first ever time on multiple shows, where he apparently ran 11 miles without stopping after trying around 2 grams. While it's not exactly clear when exactly he had started, it seems it must have happened sometime between his emancipation and him going to college, saying he liked it because he could get it and just do it by himself at home. The overall timeline of this drug use is not entirely clear, but what is clear is that he was still using by around 2016 when he was supposed to appear on the Opie and Jim Norton show on the 14th of July. The day prior, he describes going on a rather insane binge, during which he shared some of his powder with a taxi driver who got so cracked out that Theo, who had already been on it for a while, was the one who drove the taxi while the cab driver in question was too busy with a lady of the night in the back seat. Despite still being brain boggled, he managed to get on the show, where he ended up sitting next to Darryl Strawberry, a former Hall of Fame baseball player with his own history of addiction. If you listen to the episode knowing that Theo was blasted, then you probably wouldn't struggle to hear just how much he had. He sounds insane. In later videos, he describes how he could barely even speak at the time, having to wear sunglasses indoors so that his enlarged pupils wouldn't give him away. In a clip from this past weekend, he describes why exactly he sobered up, referring to this experience as his turning point. He recalls how strange it felt to sit next to Strawberry, whom he had expected to also be an addict, only to realize this man had been sober for 13 years and was very successful in his own right.
I always thought in my head, oh, Darryl Strawberry, you thought about him and you thought, oh, he's on drugs, he's this and that, he ruined his life. But then here he was in front of me, he was 13 years sober, he was eloquent, successful. That's where some things lined up in my mind and said, oh, hey, look, here you are with this gift you think you have that you can communicate. You can't even talk.
There he was, high out of his mind, having judged Strawberry to be an addict who had ruined his life, when in reality, it was Theo who was ruining his own, quite literally robbing himself of his own voice, described by himself as a gift from God. Shortly after this, he went back to Los Angeles and recounted this story to a friend, who suggested he should start going to AA meetings, advice which he followed. It would take a little bit of time before he opened up to the world about his problems, and the main place he did it ended up being this past weekend. While the podcast does largely focus on comedy, perhaps one of its biggest draws over the years has been the fact that Theo is so open, especially about his past and current demons. In an episode from May 2017, roughly 10 months after the Opie and Jim Norton incident, Theo receives a call from someone in recovery who takes his minute in the spotlight to ask for some advice, describing how boring sobriety is. After thanking the caller, Theo opens up about his own journey of sobriety. He concedes that sobriety was boring for him at the start, but as he began to dig into the reasons why he had started substances in the first place, the whole process suddenly becomes much more interesting. He describes how, for the first time in a while, he could allow himself to feel without relying on something to fill the void, and how it bettered him as a person.
You want a pill? You want to ride? You want to ride? Try feeling everything. Try having conversations with people when it's uncomfortable and you can't resort to anything else. And you have to just tell them how you really feel. Try that. That's a pill, bro.
Some years later, in 2020, in another episode of his show, Theo shares a story of his brief relapse when he found himself doing DMT, as well as having a few drinks. He goes on to clarify he only considers this a one-time thing and that he has no intention of getting into drugs again. Besides the DMT story, it does seem Theo has actually stayed sober. He ends up talking a lot about addiction on his show, especially whenever he takes calls from people looking for some personal advice from him. Among a slew of different guests he's invited on, perhaps one of the most notable is Jordan Peterson. He's been on the podcast multiple times, and the first time he had been invited on was all the way back in 2018. Unsurprisingly, they discussed the topic of sobriety, with Dr. Peterson spending his time giving Theo and others advice. The episode ended up being one of the most popular on Theo's channel, getting 5.7 million views in his lifetime. In some of Theo's recent podcasts, you may notice Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life on his shelf, in which Jordan delves into the meaning of life and the importance to balance order and chaos, among other things. Besides Jordan Peterson, Theo would discuss addiction with a number of his friends, notably Bobby Lee on his podcast Tiger Belly. In the episode with Theo, Bobby Lee shares a story about how he had recently almost broken his streak of sobriety when offered a drink. Besides his own struggles, Theo and Bobby ended up discussing the death of Eric Myers, a mutual friend of theirs and a comedian, who, due to a relapse, led him to being run over by a van on the interstate. A more notable story about Theo discussing his addiction with a guest would be his podcast episode with Bert Kreischer. Kreischer is a somewhat controversial figure in his own right, known online for very clearly being an alcoholic and yet pretending he's not. He's also caught a lot of flack for outright lying or embellishing stories about himself for no reason other than to make himself look better, and then instantly being called out for it. In an episode of this past weekend, Theo talks to Bert about addiction, asking whether Bert believes himself to be an alcoholic. As we've implied before that he would, he denies this, saying he simply drinks a lot without necessarily being an alcoholic. Most of their discussion centers around Bert denying this with all of his might that he's addicted in any way, but there are still some interesting statements from Theo, namely how if he had never found Coke, he likely never would have struggled with addiction, and that he likely wouldn't have had a problem with things like social drinking today. He further explained why he had never really enjoyed drinking, explaining that with powder, he could get high in an instant, while drinking may take some time to have an effect. Besides just his addiction problems, Theo has, over the years, used his platform to speak about many of his personal problems, including with his father, sharing his thoughts without much in the way of a filter, and generally speaking from the heart when taking calls from people. In large part, it seems Theo views his podcast as more than just a way to make money, using it in earnest to spread some of his wisdom, which, as it turns out, he's got plenty of. The earnest nature is perhaps best emphasized in his interview with Bill Burr, in which Theo's soft-spoken nature is juxtaposed by Bill's generally quite abrasive style of comedy. While Theo remains his down-to-earth self, opening up about how he feels about certain things, Bill stays true to his character by turning those feelings against him, mostly for comedy's sake. There are a couple noteworthy examples throughout the episode that demonstrate this dynamic. Early on, Theo opens up about how much it means to him to have control over the kinds of jokes he gets to say and how he gets to say them, and how valuable he finds that. Bill is quick to jump on this, essentially making fun of him for supposedly being a drama queen. Just a bit later, Theo expresses his struggles to work with people, which is why he chose to pursue comedy as a career in the first place. Again, Bill is quick to shoot Theo down, effectively telling him to get over himself and learn how to work with people. As the interview carries on, Bill's commentary becomes harsher and harsher towards Theo, despite him never really saying anything to warrant it. Eventually, Bill seems quite detached from the show, and when Theo asks a somewhat silly question, Bill rejects it quite aggressively.
So yes, he's been in a helicopter.
So I have been in one, but only with a gun, only when people had guns. Do you keep a weapon on yours or no?
On what?
In your, I don't know if you have a helicopter or if you rent a helicopter.
Do I really have to answer that? He knows goddamn well I don't have a weapon. Why are you doing this?
Overall, the interview serves as a rather fascinating dive into both of their personalities. While Bill remains unapologetic in providing very harsh critiques of Theo whenever he opens up, sometimes mocking him outright, Theo is very civil, treating Bill with as much respect at the end of the episode as he did at the beginning. In the This Past Weekend episode that directly followed this interview, Theo went into how he had felt about it. He says that, despite Bill Burr being quite harsh at times, he actually took a lot away from it, expressing he was still glad to have had the chance to interview him.
It was just a tough conversation, man. It wasn't bad. I think some of his stuff about manning up and sacking up, and I think I needed to hear that. Sometimes only certain ways you can hear something. Every now and then, somebody who holds some weight in your life will hit you with that bat. With a bat full of facts, bro, that fact bat.
It's very interesting to compare Theo's response to Bill Burr's antics to Ethan Klein's response, who was a lot less understanding of Bill, going on to say in later interviews he actually needed therapy due to the podcast.
Oh, welcome to the Bill Burr recovery group.
Yeah, I went into therapy after that episode. I'm not even being kidding.
Theo certainly did a good job of holding his own. At this point, you may have the impression that Theo is just a great guy to get along with, who doesn't really get involved with conflicts of ego in the same way many other online personalities do. You would mostly be correct in assuming this, but that isn't to say he's never been involved throughout his long career as a comedian, with some of it going back decades. For this first situation, we have to introduce you to Christina Pajitsky, professionally known as Christina P. She's a semi-successful comedian and podcaster in her own right, co-hosting the Your Mom's House podcast with her husband, Tom Segura. Many people may not be aware of the fact that before her comedy debut, Christina got her start in the same place as Theo, the MTV reality show Road Rules. For the most part, she doesn't exactly seem enthused to talk about her past nowadays, and the reasons behind this are open to interpretation. What we do know is that in 2003, Christina P. and Theo both participated in Challenge Battle of the Sexes, which they would later be interviewed about in 2012. By then, they had both moved past their days of reality TV. Tom and Christina have run their own show for quite a few years, with most of their guests being from the comedy world. Yet, despite all the varied personalities that had appeared on the show, there was one that they would continue to omit for the longest time: Theo Von. One fateful day, they invited Brendan Schaub for an appearance, and he mentioned offhandedly that Theo felt like Tom and Christina didn't like him, which he thought was the reason why he wasn't being invited. The host dismissed the idea, shifting the topic to something else rather quickly.
Theo thinks you guys don't like him, by the way.
Why?
I don't know. He's like, because we got done doing the show today.
Oh
He's
my-
like, where you going? I'm like, I'm going to do Your Mom's House with Tom and Christina. He's like, oh. He's like, I'm like, have you done it before? I love them. He's like, nope, they don't invite me, man. He's like, I don't think they like me. I'm like, I think that's your issue.
Former Road Rules alum. Are you kidding me?
I didn't know you were on there.
Hey, did we mention the fart mic?
This may sound a tad suspicious to quite a few of you, and a lot of the viewers did find it suspect. Quickly after that fateful appearance by Brendan, threads began to pop up on Reddit questioning if there was real hostility between Tom and Theo. The original poster went as far as to mention potential rumors of Christina and Theo having hooked up prior to her getting married to Tom. These were very tantalizing rumors to commenters, and people quickly began to dig deeper into these claims. If you go into the comments, you'll find a link to a video that we've already shown you, being Theo and Christina's 2012 interview where they were asked about Road Rules, and in particular, this one clip of them holding hands. This isn't exactly a smoking gun, and back when the interview was first released, it doesn't look like anyone thought much of it. But given the seeming unwillingness of Tom Segura to invite Theo on the show, this created enough wiggle room in people's minds to go truly wild with speculation, which led to Theogate. Quickly, internet sleuths began to scour the internet for any piece of evidence that would somehow prove this whole theory, and what they began to find was certainly interesting. On the 13th of December, 2018, Christina was a guest on the Tiger Belly podcast, and when the topic of Theo Von came up, she turned a bit sheepish, and when asked a question about if she knew him, she was very clear that they were just acquaintances.
Are you friends with Theo?
I know him. We're not bros. I met him a couple times when we did the shows. I've seen him around.
Just a couple months later, in May of 2019, Ethan and Hila were invited to the YMH podcast. In one very interesting moment, Ethan asks if Tom and Theo have any beef between them, and after Tom stares daggers at him for an uncomfortable while, there's a very obvious cut, after which there's no further mention of Theo.
Wait, hold on. I want to ask you guys about Theo Von, because there's like a whole beef with you guys there, isn't there?
But the post did not stop there, and neither did the sleuthing. The scouring for evidence continued, and the rumors only spread further. Reddit posts like this one caught the attention of people, further theorizing about what happened and why there was this secret animosity. Theo was the first to properly respond in episode 206 of his podcast. In it, he denies any rumors of ever having hooked up with Christina, implying they were never really that close. He also mentions how he and the YMH crew were talking more in light of the drama, suggesting he may eventually be invited on the show. This appearance would indeed materialize after a time in YMH episode 5:05. They didn't actually address anything related to the Theogate drama until the last half hour of the podcast. In fact, the only reason they seem to be addressing it at all is because the editor reminded them that was supposed to be the purpose of the podcast. While the purpose may have been to silence Theogate forever, all it really did was send the so-called online detectives into maximum overdrive, and some of the videos got downright silly. Here we have an in-depth body language analysis, which is intended to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Tom, Christina, and Theo are all lying, and that the rumors behind Theogate are in fact true. About a month after the release of the podcast, the YMH Studios channel released a video called Theo Von #invitation only behind the scenes YMH mini doc. In this video, Tom, Christina, and Theo all claim that much of the so-called proof people had come up with, including comments made by Theo, the H3 slip, and many others, had actually been fabricated by Tom Segura with the intention of trolling the so-called flat earthers of the comedy world who believe there was indeed an affair they had been trying to cover up.
He's got that other show with the mouse guy.
Okay, so I talked to Theo. He loved the mouse guy thing. Yeah.
In the end, the video was somewhat successful at convincing other fans, or at least quelling the rumors. But that doesn't entirely address all the claims made by the Theogate crowd, which caused some people to doubt the whole video, seeing it more as an attempt to silence it than tell the truth. While the drama had mostly died down, YouTubers like The Gamer from Mars made videos about it, with GFM particularly stating that he was entirely convinced by the behind-the-scenes video. This drama, for the most part, did not have a real effect on any of the parties involved. While the rumors have continued to this day, they're treated with about the same respect as actual flat earthers. There would be a few videos made on the topic later, including one by a channel called Comedy Enforcement, who recaps the entire situation, arguing the reactions given by Tom during the episode with Theo were simply too real for all of it to be staged.
The look on Tom's face after watching that video seemed pretty real. I think it would be giving them way too much credit for great acting, because in my opinion, the video of her and Theo holding hands is a little bit sus.
The pinned comment on the video also states that Tom had known about the affair, and for the sake of keeping things professional, he had manufactured most of it to make the whole drama die down. Besides this, Theo stayed relatively clean in terms of drama, largely avoiding it wherever he could. That said, his track record following Theogate is not entirely spotless. On the 8th of December 2022, Theo featured on the BFFs podcast. The episode has a fair share of rather awkward moments, as Theo's not really allowed to engage the hosts in the way he usually would. It all culminates in this moment where he recalls how his parents' friend's car had been stolen, and how a year later they walked right by the car by accident, took out their keys, and stole it back. This led to Bry Chicken Fry, one of the co-hosts, pointing out this sounded similar to a story from a show called Shameless. Theo was quick to deflect this accusation and actually seems to take it quite personally, going as far as to say he would never steal anyone else's bits. He then goes on to accuse Lil Dicky of stealing a number of his jokes. The whole time he seems quite agitated, repeating that he'd been stolen from multiple times, but he didn't specify a lot of specific jokes that may have been taken. Now, accusations of this caliber are incredibly dangerous in the comedy world, as the act of stealing jokes is considered to be perhaps one of the worst crimes a comedian could commit, and in many cases it's tantamount to professionally jumping out of the battle bus without a glider. So when Theo accused a fellow comedian of joke theft and didn't actually specify, it was certainly somewhat unusual. Without any examples of his own, people on the internet took it upon themselves to find out how legitimate the claims of joke theft actually were. As it turns out, there is at least one example from Lil Dicky of a joke that seems similar to one that Theo had made years prior. On the 11th of April 2020, Lil Dicky released the 7th episode of the first season of his comedy show. The main crux of the episode, and the concept which the episode is named after, are wooden shirts. The joke, in fact, is quite similar to a joke Theo had made in the past, in which he recalls how his friend's dad once made a wooden shirt for Christmas. But in fairness to Lil Dicky, the main thing the jokes share is the concept of the wooden shirt, and while they are similar, it could be a coincidence. Besides this, no other jokes from the Dave show were ever claimed to be stolen from Theo, and notably, he never made any comments about it outside the one episode of BFFs. If you ask me, it's more likely the only reason he had even mentioned this at all was as an emotional deflection of being accused of stealing stories earlier, which I should note is also quite unlikely to be the case. And given he never revisited the accusation, we can probably assume he regretted bringing it up at all. In March 2023, a podcast called Bussin' with the Boys, hosted by former football player Will Compton and not technically retired but currently unemployed football player Taylor Lewin, made a remark that Theo Von had been taking some shots at them during the latest episode of this past weekend. The two co-hosts responded in kind, taking a few comedic jabs at Theo without going into depth about what may have led to the reaction. They also declared in no uncertain terms that this constitutes beef between them. The comments they're referring to are from this past weekend 435 and this past weekend 436 with Caleb Presley. In the former, he takes a jab at Taylor Lewin, one of the two co-hosts of Bussin' with the Boys, making fun of a string of injuries he had received that led him to be released from his contract. In the latter episode, he targets Compton for supposedly having bad eyesight. While the cast of Bussin' with the Boys suggested the comments were pretty much entirely unprovoked, Theo did actually give an explanation for his feelings of animosity in the episode with Caleb. In it, Theo ended up revealing that Will Compton had played a bit of a prank on Theo when he had sent him a text message claiming that Caleb, who was a close friend of Theo, had suddenly passed away. In fairness, as Caleb goes on to explain what happened during this prank, it seems Will had sent an image immediately disproving this, showing Caleb being alive and well. However, given Theo was just about to board an airplane, he hadn't received the image, meaning he spent the entire flight thinking Caleb was dead. While this likely made for an even more hilarious prank for Will and Caleb, Theo ended up being quite negatively impacted by the experience.
I remember I was literally crying in my seat, and there was like I don't want to say a gay guy that was in there, but some guy kept like for some reason, I think when I was kind of teared up and stuff, it gave him like an opportunity to kind of
slide in.
Yeah, like, oh, I'm gonna slip into this fragile boy right here.
In no uncertain terms, Theo was quite open about how Will Compton's prank got under his skin.
You and Will still have beef?
I mean, I would say I'm not super fond of somebody that's gonna, first of all, not even fake their own, at least fake your own death.
Yeah, don't throw me under the bus, under the grave.
I would say this.
Would you fight him if you saw him?
I don't know if it would be on site, but I think if somebody arranged something.
From the perspective of the Bussin' with the Boys crew, the prank did not really warrant a response of this caliber. That said, neither of the parties seemed to be all that concerned with the so-called beef, as both the respective podcasts were more focused on making jokes than actually trying to make any larger point. Perhaps the most notable thing about the latter two controversies is what they say about Theo himself. In a way, they both paint him as quite an emotional person, and the second story really gives the impression he has some trauma related to loss, which would be quite understandable given his history. As we've discussed before, Theo's relationship with his father was strained. In the video where he discussed it, he recalled how when he was a kid, he would always carefully watch the sidewalk so his elderly father wouldn't trip. Then, as time wore on and Theo grew older, he would often either deliberately lag behind or walk ahead just because he was too ashamed of walking next to him. Theo admits he never really allowed himself to feel much for his own father, perhaps because he'd always been aware that his father would die early in his life. It wasn't until years later, right there on this past weekend, that he allowed himself to feel for him, to acknowledge how much he had actually cared for him, and to cope with his death in a healthy way.
He gave me my existence, however way it happened. You know, he really gave me the most important gift, which is my experience of the world. And I judged him so much and that I didn't really get to know him.
I may have given the impression that most of the conflicts Theo has been involved in are rather inconsequential, and that is the case, bar one. For this next part, I need to introduce you to a quaint little company called Cast Media. Launched at some point in 2016 in Santa Monica by a man named Colin Thompson, Cast Media describes itself as a production company that specializes in podcasts. In practice, they function more as an ad agency, partnering up with shows that produce content. Since 2016, they've entered into agreements with multiple shows, this past weekend included among them. In essence, the company would secure sponsors for podcasts, which the podcasters would do advertising for which they would get paid a cut of whatever Cast Media had been paid. It was a fairly simple business model, and one that had the potential to make a lot of money for a lot of people. As it happens, this rather nice arrangement didn't last, and starting in July 2022, the company was said to have been behind on payments to multiple podcasters. Certain creators would take their grievances to the public, and while it's hard to say where it all started, there are a couple noteworthy examples. On the 23rd of July 2023, Jim Cornette released a video titled Jim Cornette on Colin Thompson and Cast Media. In this hour-long takedown of the company, the host describes a business relationship they had with Cast, the trouble they encountered while working for them, missed payments, and in particular, they took a heavy focus on Colin, the company founder. The video itself didn't provide much in the way of proof, and while it was decently well received, it didn't seem to be making many waves at that point in time. On the 6th of September 2023, Theo released the 461st episode of his podcast. The same day, he published a dedicated clip from it focused on the Cast Media drama. In it, he discussed his business relationship with the company, accusing them of skipping out on payments to multiple creators, overall owing a sum of $4 million in ad payments. Theo claimed he'd spoken to people who were owed anywhere from 6 to 7 figures each, and that this past weekend in particular was owed 6 figures as well. He clarified that this constituted a breach of contract, which allowed both him and other creators involved to end their partnerships with the company. Notably, he also takes a shot at Colin himself, accusing him of effectively fleecing other content creators. He also talks about a recent pursued acquisition of some Cast Media properties by a company called Live One, the subsidiary of which, Podcast One, was supposed to go live on NASDAQ in the following days. In light of this new acquisition, Theo claims that Colin Thompson offered to repay the debt by paying off a significant portion of it in stock, if Theo and other creators were willing to enter another agreement with Cast Media. Of course, given that stock hadn't even gone public, the actual stock price was highly speculative, which is an argument also made by Theo. In fact, he goes as far as to claim that the worth of the stock is practically dependent on how many big-name creators they'd be able to sign back onto the company after they were previously mistreated. The podcast itself ended up being a success, but this clip in particular ended up accruing 1.5 million views, getting far more attention than any content made on the topic by other creators. Pretty soon as this clip began circulating, news articles were popping up. The Verge and Bloomberg were quick to stir the pot, releasing their own articles within the following days. In it, they recounted the situation as it went according to these creators. The Verge in particular included quotes from people like Whitney Cummings, who revealed that she was owed $350,000 in sponsorship money. The Bloomberg article also reveals that one of these creators, Alex Weiss, has actually filed a lawsuit against Cast Media, claiming damages to the tune of $550,000. Her lawsuit names the company, Colin Thompson, as well as Wesley R. Stevens and Wesley Odell as defendants. In the lawsuit, it's claimed that Thompson's lawyer had emailed her in November 2022, saying he would like to terminate her contract with her due to her obscene, vulgar content. The lawyer allegedly offered that if she terminated the original agreement with Cast, she would receive 3 months worth of unpaid installments, which would have been around $68,000, to which she apparently agreed, only to not even be paid in the end. The lawsuit was only filed on the 11th of September, and given how long these things tend to take, we would rather not pass any definitive judgments. It's worth noting that Colin himself made a statement on the whole situation, which is displayed in both articles. In his statement, he explained that there was nothing malicious behind not paying out the creators, and that much of it was down to the fact that advertising revenue had taken a massive hit after July 2022. He claims that this forced him to downsize the company, letting go of multiple employees and even cutting his own salary just to make up the difference. He also claims his plan to pay off the debts with the company's stocks was a genuine attempt to mend the issue. Given the sheer amount of podcasters who have made claims against the company, it's fair to say there really could be something here. But until the lawsuit's conclusion, all we can do is guess. Regarding Theo's involvement in the situation, besides being the creator who truly brought the issue to the spotlight, it doesn't seem likely he'll ever come to involve himself in the situation in any way after this. He's implied he doesn't really care about the money lost, and that his only real goal with talking about it was to discourage others from even partnering with Cast Media and to stay as far away from Colin as possible. Something worth noting is a video about the topic made by CoffeeZilla, in which the eponymous YouTuber does a deep dive on the whole drama. He goes in depth in questioning the actual talent involved, asking them about how much they were owed, the frequency of payments, and everything related to the scandal. More notably, however, he actually interviewed Colin Thompson personally, who gave his own recounting of events.
You're being accused of basically stealing $4 million. Your clients say you defrauded them. What's your side of the story?
Yeah, I appreciate you reaching out,
He claims that prior to around February 2023, they were able to pay their creators fairly without any problems, and he insisted that they had managed to provide their creators a lot more income than what they may have been able to get by themselves. He then says that the reason why he had eventually accrued a debt of $4 million to his creators is that the value of an ad spot went down by 58%. In the video, CoffeeZilla also interviews a former accountant of Cast Media who cast some doubt on these claims, saying there had been issues with payments of the creators pretty much from the beginning, with delays and even inaccurate accounting being a very regular problem. He also claims that Colin had spent much of 2022 going on expensive holidays, presumably from the money he had gotten from the company. The biggest problem to me seems to be that creators were being promised money that this company just wasn't taking in. They should have only offered creators what they actually had in their company bank account, or what they could guarantee was going to be in the bank, instead of promising them everything and giving them nothing. Coffee's video paints a fairly negative image of Colin Thompson, with some damning statements from former workers and talent under Cast Media's umbrella.
You joined them in 2018. So when did you start getting late payments?
That was right before, from the first check we were supposed to get. It didn't arrive when he said.
It was never on time. So
Yeah.
It wasn't unusual if it was like a month late, a month and a half late. And then when it goes from, all right, a month late to 2 months late to 3 months late. And then I would say, hey, where's the deposit at? I go, yep, they're trying to figure out, man. He says he has whatever investment coming, you're gonna get this huge lump sum of money. So then that's didn't come, then you're looking at, now you're looking at 4 months, like, with the money.
Regardless of Colin's intentions, now that he's out of the picture, hopefully all of these podcasters can receive the money they were supposed to, and Colin Thompson can never be involved in an ad agency ever again. Regardless of how you feel about Theo, there's no denying his success. Today, he's grown to be one of the largest podcasters on the whole of YouTube, and his name within the comedy world has only grown larger with time. Practically every venue he goes to for a stand-up comedy is sold out, and this past weekend nets him hundreds of thousands of views every week. Added to that are the thousands of people on his Patreon page, and it's very hard to argue the man isn't doing well. And with his fame only continuing to skyrocket, there's truly no telling what heights he'll reach. Whatever they are, I'm sure people will be watching. I've been Turkey Tom, thanks for watching, and until next time, leave me alone.